Hi there friends, welcome to episode 4 of Learn to Design, Then Knit. It's finally time to start casting on our projects. Over the last 3 episodes, we've been going into detail about how to estimate for yardage and how to plan for our garment. Now we finally get to see that all come to fruition. Before we dive into those details today, there's 2 things I want to do as kind of a housekeeping situation. The first is I made an error in my math in episode 3. I think it will help you understand how that happens if you see what my setup looks like at my desk. So at any given time, I've got 3 tripods going to hold the camera that is shooting at me right now. One is holding a light above me, and another one is holding a ring light and camera mount for top-down videos. So when I went about shooting last episode, I was trying to do it, I don't want to say on the fly. I had a plan, but I was doing it in real time. So you could see how I worked through all of the numbers for real, because I think that really shows you how the process works. However, I don't have a physical calculator. I often use my phone for the calculating. Because my phone is my camera, I didn't have that ability to do that. So I was using the calculator on my computer, which is set up behind my camera, trying to do it all with my my mouse as opposed to my keyboard, because that was well out of the way for the video. So all that to say, I apologize if anybody did the math with me on the yoke portion of my garment last week or last episode. The formula I gave you is correct. I just somehow input my numbers incorrectly. So all that to say, I had to add a little bit of yardage to my project because I had underestimated. So if you have any questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask. I really appreciate the viewer who called me out on it. They're like, wait a minute, my math isn't mathing. Did I do it wrong or did you do it wrong? So turns out I did it wrong. So the second is that I have created a forum on Ravelry where we can not only ask questions in long form and share real examples, but also share updates on our project, share the yarn you're using, whatever you want to do. So I've got a link in the description below this video that will take you to that Ravelry forum. I've made an initial post, and in that post at the top of the page are instructions on how you can tag me. Ravelry calls it ear burning, but because I don't get notifications every time someone posts in one of those forums, if you need my input sooner rather than later, please be sure to use that method to tag me or ear burn me so that I see your comment. I won't be checking it all day, every day, like I would if it was an email, for example, but if you need help, that's a great place to ask. So as I promised in last episode, 2 weeks ago, today is going to get pretty mathy once again. I'm going to be showing you my desktop with me working through all of the math once again to convert our sketches or schematics of our drawing or our garments into the actual numbers that we're going to use, as well as a layout template to help you write the back portion of your pattern. So we're going to go top down, and this time I've done the math ahead of time so that there shouldn't be any errors in the numbers. But I walk through every step, potentially some of it ad nauseum, but I just want to make sure that you're clear on where I'm getting my numbers from so that you can take it and transpose it into your written pattern. Now, unlike our last episode, while I was trying to do the math on the fly and ended up with that small error in my calculations, today I did all of the math ahead of time so that there's no mistakes in my numbers, but I'm going to walk through every step so you can help or start planning how to knit the back of your garment and actually cast on and knit it over the course of the next 2 weeks. So by now, this schematic should look pretty familiar to you. This is the back of my designed garment. I have designed it to have a small stockinette stitch border around every piece. I will have my fisherman's stockinette rib fisherman's stockinette fabric in the center of my body and my ribbing at the bottom. So we're going to be doing some very specific calculations to figure out how many stitches we need to cast on and how many stitches we need to reach to target our cross back of our garment. Don't worry about this yet. We will talk about this today, but don't feel like you've missed anything. This is the first time you're seeing this. So we're going to start at the very top by inputting our project gauge. Now, because we're knitting different swatches and different projects, this will not be your gauge, but input your gauge right at the very top. My gauge is 20 stitches and 50 rows equals 4 inches or 10 centimeters. If you are working in inches, what we want to do is simplify these numbers down to be 1 inch. So all we're going to do is take our stitches and divide it by 4, which is 5, and our rows and divide it by 4, and that's 12. What this now tells us is that for 1 square inch of fabric, it will take us 5 stitches and 12.5 rows. So quite simply, we want to start at the very top of our garment. We're going to take our target width, which for me is 7.5 inches, and we're going to multiply it by our stitch gauge. Remember, I converted it to 1 inch, which is 5 stitches, so I'm going to multiply 7.5 by 5, and I get a total of 37.5 stitches. Now, we can't knit half a stitch, so here's a case where you need to make a decision for what you want your garment to be. My stitch fabric is a multiple of 2 stitches. I want each edge stitch along the increase edges to be the same. So I'm going to work it as an odd number, meaning if I start here with a knit stitch, I will end here with a knit stitch, and the stitches in between will be the opposite. So basically what I want to do is say, okay, my 37.5, I could round down to 37 or round up to 38. I know I want it to be an odd number of stitches, so I'm simply going to round this to be 37 stitches. So I'm just going to go ahead and cross out that 5 and say 37 is my target. However, because we are seaming this garment, we are going to lose 1 stitch at each seaming edge. That's going to be down the raglan seams and down the side seams of the garment. So when I have this number determined, in my case 37, I'm going to add 2 stitches for the seam. This is not your raglan column, but the actual stitch that you will lose at each edge when you seam. So our target is 37, so we add 2, which means my target is 39. Once again, I can cross out that 0.5. I just left it there so you could see how I did my math. I took my original, added 2, and then got rid of that half. So my target number of stitches for my cast on edge is 39, knowing that when I seam this to the sleeves, I will have 37 stitches remaining at that top edge. The next step that we're going to do is going to be exactly the same, but instead of working with our cast on edge, we're going to be working with our target cross body width. This is half of the target circumference of your finished garment. In my original design, my garment was 48 1/8 inch in circumference, so I divide that by 2, and my target is 24 1/16 of an inch. So we're going to do the exact same math here. I'm going to multiply that 24 1/16, I just converted it to a decimal here, by our stitch gauge, which is 5 stitches over 1 inch, and I get 120.3 stitches. Just like at the top of the garment where I added 2 stitches, we're going to add 2 stitches to this target because we'll lose a stitch at each edge when we seam. So instead of a full or a target stitch count of 120.3, my target will be 122.3. At the risk of sounding redundant, we can't knit 0.3 of a stitch, so I'm going to round this up to 123. You could round this down to 122. However, because we're starting with an odd number, we want our target to be an odd number so that our increases down each edge will be even. So now I know that the difference between my cast on edge, which is at the neckline, and my target stitches, which is the bottom width or half the width of our total target circumference, is 84 stitches. That means to get from my target or my cast on at the neckline to my target width at the underarms, I need to increase a total of 84 stitches down these two edges. That also means that we want to have an even number of stitches down each edge. So we'll divide that 84 by 2 and come up with 42. So as I am knitting this way down my yoke, I am going to be increasing stitches along this edge at the same rate that I'm increasing stitches along this edge. So I will increase 42 stitches down this edge and 42 stitches down this edge. So now we've figured out the math for the top portion of our garment for the widths. What we need to do is figure out the depth and convert it into rows and go from there. So going back to my previous schematics, which I've drawn in here, I know that my target yoke depth for the garment that I want to make is 7 3/4 inches. When I convert that into rows using my 12.5 rows per inch, I'm simply going to multiply my target of 7.75 by 12.5 and I get 96.9 rows. You'll see I've rounded that up to 97. Here's why. Because we're working flat, we're going to want to end with an odd numbered row. But we also like to start with an odd numbered row at the cast on edge. This makes picking up stitches for the collar easier. So while I could round this down to 96, I want it to be 97 so that I start with an odd row and end with a odd row before I move into the body. Now let's talk about short rows. That's this funny little wedge shape that I've drawn in here. If we were working this garment in the round, we would be able to work the short rows at the top of the collar. The short rows add length to the back of our garment because our center depth down the center front of our body is shorter than the center length down the back of our body. So by adding in some short rows across the back of the garment, we're giving a little bit of extra length to the back of the garment so that we don't get that riding up feeling where the garment wants to try and slide backwards in the front to make up for the difference in length in our back. So you can use a different number if you like. Industry averages for a wide range of body sizes is somewhere between 1 1/4 inches up to 1 3/4 inches. Most designers that I work with use 1.5 inches. So because we are going to be seaming this garment and we're going to have a sleeve that we seam it to, we need to ensure that this length at the edge of our seam is the same length as the yoke in our back. So although I have drawn this to look like a bit of a wedge that I've shown in here, when we are done all of our increasing to reach our target yoke depth, we are simply going to knit the total number of rows that equals 1.5 inches or whatever short row length you would like to add to your garment. In effect, that is going to add length to your body, but we're not going to be considering it part of the body. When we work our sleeves, we will actually be working our short rows as a wedge. And so this wedge here is going to match this wedge here so that the two lengths of our back armhole edge are the same. The front armhole edges will be shorter because they won't incorporate any of those short rows. We'll come to that next week, so don't panic, or next video I should say, so don't worry about this too much yet. All I want to say is that when you have completed all of your yoke increases, we are simply going to knit 1.5 inches straight without any extra increases. In order to do the math for these short rows, we're going to do the same we've been doing up to this point. we're going to take our target short row length, which for me is 1.5 inches, and I'm going to multiply that by my row gauge, which is 12.5 rows over 1 inch, which works out to be 18.75 rows. I'm going to round this down to 18 because I still want to have my front and back of my garment start and end with a wrong side row, so this needs to be an odd number. So my target short rows are 1.5 inches. They will be just ever so slightly shorter than 1.5 because I'm choosing to round down to 18 rows to make sure that I start and end with a wrong side row. So now that we've worked through the target stitches that we need for our cast on, and the number of stitches that we need to increase to, as well as our total yoke depth, now we need to move on to working out the spacing of our shaping down the length of the yoke. I've already established that I need to increase 42 stitches on each edge of my yoke, and I've established that I've got 115 rows over which to do this. When we start calculating the rows that we need to work our increases, we're going to subtract 1 from this number. When we start our garment, we're going to cast on and then work a setup row. That setup row, we're not going to work any increases, so we're simply going to omit that from our total count. So what that means is, for the purposes of my increases, I'm going to say I have 114 rows over which to increase my 42 stitches. So to figure out our spacing, we're going to divide our total number of rows over which to work our shaping by the total number of increase rows that we have to work. Remember, our increase rows are half the total number of stitches that we have to increase. So we'll divide our 42, or whatever your number is, into your total number of rows, and we come up with a number. If the total number of stitches to increase, say 84, is the same as the number of rows you have to work in your yoke, 84, then your increasing rate will be every other row, because you'd have to work 42 increase rows over 84 total rows. But the odds are really good that this number that you get as a result will be a decimal number, just like I have for my yoke. A decimal number means that we're going to have different rates of shaping down the length of your yoke. If you're like me, where you work your increases only on right side rows, that means that you'll work intervals of 2-row shaping and intervals of 4-row shaping. If you're comfortable with increasing on wrong side rows, you can increase at 2-row intervals and round this up to be 3-row intervals. So you would increase on right side rows and right side and wrong side rows. If the number that you get as a result when you divide your rows is between 1 and 2, as opposed to mine, which is between 2 and 3s, you will increase in 1-row intervals and 2-row intervals. So going back to my example where my result is 2.71, I'm going to increase every 2 rows, which is rounding this number down, or every 4 rows, which is rounding this number up to the next even multiple. As I mentioned, I only like to work my increases on right side rows. If you want to work your increases on right side and wrong side rows, you would round up to be 3 instead of 4. So now that we know our interval of shaping, we need to determine how many times we have to work each interval of shaping to increase our total number of rows, which is 42 rows or 84 stitches, over our total yoke length of 114 rows, or whatever your length is. So I'm going to say that X will be the number of times I work a 2-row interval, and Y will be the number of times I work at 4-row interval. So our first crack at determining the rate of shaping is kind of just guessing. I started by saying I think I need to work 30 rows or 30 intervals of 2-row shaping. So I'm going to multiply 30 by 2, which is my 2-row shaping, and I get 60. Since our target number of increased rows is 42, that would leave me with 12 intervals that I have to work at, 12 times that I need to work at a 4-row interval. 42 minus 30 is 12. We always need this number, 30 and 12, or whatever your combination are, to add up to our total number of rows. So if I multiply those remaining 12 increases by 4 for my 4-row intervals, I get 48. When I add up those 60 rows from my 2-row interval and the 48 rows of my 4-row interval, I get a total of 108 rows. That does not equal 114. I am 6 rows short, right? Because 118 subtracted from 114 is 6. Since my interval, my lower interval of shaping is 2 rows, and our difference between 114 and 108 is 6, I'm going to divide that 6 by 2, which is my lower interval of shaping, and I get 3. What that 3 tells me is I need to work 3 fewer intervals of 2-row shaping, and 3 more intervals of 4-row shaping. So what I come up with now is that I will work 27 intervals of 2-row shaping, which gives me 54 rows, and 15, 3 more than 12, repeats of 4-row intervals, which gives me 60 rows. Now when I add up these two sets of rows, 54 and 60, I get 114 rows. So now I know that this here, I'm going to put lots of check marks beside it. This here is the rate of shaping that I want to use. I could even just cross that out because I'm not going to need it anymore. So when it comes to shaping my yolk, I will have to work 27 2-row intervals and 15 4-row intervals. How we choose to space these rates of shaping is really up to the individual knitter. I'm going to show you what my pattern will look like when it's written out with this information put in, just as soon as we complete the final step of our back. I want to make sure we walk through the final process of getting all of our numbers for each different section, so when we move on to writing our instructions, there's no guessing. Once we reach the target number of stitches at our underarm and all of our short rows are complete, it's time to work the body of the garment. From the underarm seam, I want my body to be 14 inches from the underarm to the bottom hem. That 14 inches will include 2 inches of ribbing at the bottom of my garment. This number may differ from you, but essentially what we want to do is determine how many inches to knit before the ribbing and then how many inches to knit after the ribbing. If you are someone who prefers to simply knit to measurement, you can do that. There's nothing you would need to do in this section beyond knowing that you've already got your target stitches and you can just knit to your target length. If you're like me, I prefer to work to my row gauge and knit a specific number of rows so that I can use my row counter and just not worry about it. I know it will end up the right length when I'm done. So I said just a moment ago, my target body length from the underarm is 14 inches. I'm going to subtract 2 inches from that for my ribbing, and I'm left with 12 inches of body. This body simply meaning in my established pattern, or whatever fabric you decide to create in the body of your sweater. So I'm going to multiply my target length of 12 by my row gauge of 12.5, and I end up with 150 rows. So this length here, whoops, that's hard to draw when you're looking through a camera. That's 150 rows. That's supposed to be this shape. There we go. That looks a little bit better. Okay, so 150 rows. Now I want to make sure I know how many rows of ribbing I will work at the bottom. So I will multiply my 2 inches by my row gauge of 12.5 and I get 25. So my 2 inches here will be 25 rows of ribbing. In total, that works out to be 175 rows in my body. That makes me feel happy. If you prefer to knit to measurements, I absolutely encourage that. Now let's take a detailed look at transposing all of the numbers that we just worked through into written instructions that will be more like a knitting pattern that you're used to working from. I'm going to bounce back and forth between these two documents a little bit so you can see where I'm pulling the numbers from, but essentially I've created this document as a template for you to use as a jumping off point. My numbers are going to differ from yours, but I've tried to leave the instructions as vague as I can so that when you're writing your instructions for yourself and your numbers, you can input the details of your fabric, whatever stitch pattern you've chosen, into this document as easily as you can. I'll have a link in the description below this video for you to download this document directly from my Dropbox so you can save it and modify it as you need to. Okay, so starting off at the very top of our instructions, we're simply going to have our cast on. This is 39 stitches, which mimics the 39 stitches that I calculated for my back neck width. You can use whatever cast on method that you like. I prefer to pick up and knit along a long tail cast on edge when I'm picking up and knitting for a collar, but you can use whatever method you'd like. I don't particularly recommend using a provisional cast on in the case of a seamed garment for a couple of reasons. One, it can make seaming a little fussier if you have live stitches at the top of your garment, but largely because we want that neckline edge to have as much structure as we can. If you were to use a provisional cast on, it would have a lot less structure, so I just find it easier to use a firm cast on like a long tail or a twisted German or even a knitted cast on if that's your preference. So once we've got our required number of stitches cast on, we will work our first setup row. This row gives us an instruction to place any markers that we need to place for our raglan columns. And it's also, in my opinion, a good place to have, or a good practice, to have one row at the very top edge where you're picking up that is not in pattern. When we have to pick up our stitches into that cast on edge, I find it easier to have the very top row, so just working it all in purl stitches, so that we can see all of the little V's that we have to pick up and knit into. Again, this is your choice. I'm just giving you my recommendations on best practices. All right, so this setup row is counted as the first row of my total target yoke depth. Remember I said that I needed 115 rows to reach my target depth. This is row 1. So for the remainder of my yoke shaping, I have 114 rows over which I can work all of my increases. For a traditional raglan shape, we want the angle of our raglan to be fairly consistent down the length of our garment. Depending on your rate of shaping, you may need to do some compound raglan shaping. Compound raglan shaping is something you can learn more about in my episodes of Knit Talk, episodes 53 and 64 of my podcast, and I'm going to have links to that in the description below. In my math, when we worked out the interval of shaping for my yoke, we determined that I needed to work 27 2-row intervals and 15 4-row intervals to use up all 114 rows. To determine how I apply those rates of shaping in those quantities, we have a little bit more math to do. I want to have as even a slope as I can down my raglan column as opposed to having a shape like a Z, which is what you would find in compound raglan shaping. I'm going to find the simplest method of spacing my intervals down the yoke to create this shape. First thing that I do is I determine the greatest common factor, or the GCF, between my two numbers. I need to work the 27 2-row intervals and 15 4-row intervals, so I'm looking for the greatest common factor between 27 and 15. This isn't complicated math. As a matter of fact, I end up just typing into Google the GCF of 27 and 15. You would use your numbers, and Google will tell you what that number is. In my case, that number is 3. So what I'm then going to do is take those two numbers, 27 and 15, and divide each by 3. 27 divided by 3 is 9, and 15 divided by 3 is 5. So I know that I now need to work 9 2-interval shaping and 5 4-interval shaping in each repeat down my yoke. This, when I say repeat, I just mean the simplest number of rows you can use to repeat down your yoke to give you the smoothest angle of your raglan column. Since I know that 9 times 2 is 18 and 5 times 4 is 20, my repeat down my yoke will be 38 rows long. You can see here I start at row 1 and I end at row 38. So I just thought it would be worth walking through this so you can see how the spacing works if it's slightly more complicated. Like I think my spacing is slightly more complicated. If you have simpler numbers than this, I'm very happy for you. Just know that your spacing is likely going to be quite different from this. So I start out by working, or I guess I should back up and say, I have to work the 9 multiples of 2 interval shaping and 5 multiples of 4 interval shaping. 9 is quite a bit higher than 5, so I'm going to work more intervals of 2 row shaping. This is basic math. I'm sure you're with me. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start out by working my 2 row shaping once. So that's one time. And then I'm going to repeat those rows one more time. So I have now worked 2 intervals of 2 row shaping. So I've got 7 left. Next, what I want to do is move on to my 4 row intervals and my 2 row intervals. Because I need to work 7 more of the 2 row interval and 5 of the 4 row interval, I can alternate them. So I'll work my 4 row interval, meaning I'll have a right side increase, a wrong side, a right side with no increase, and a wrong side, followed by my 2 row interval where I've got an increase and a wrong side with no shaping. So this is 4 and this is 2. So I've worked 1 4 row interval, 1 2 row interval, and then I'm going to repeat that 4 more times. So in total, I've worked 5 4 row intervals and 5 2 row intervals. My 4 row intervals are now done. I only needed to work them 5 times in this repeat, so they're done. I've now worked 5 more intervals of my 2 row shaping. So I'll add the 5 2 row intervals to the 2 2 row intervals I've already worked. So now by the time I get to here, I have worked 7 total 2 row intervals and 5 of my 4 row intervals. To complete this pattern over the 38 rows, I have to work rows 1 and 2, which was a 2 row interval, 2 more times, which gives me the final 2 of my required 9 2 row intervals. So it is a little bit complex, but I'm going to encourage you to step back and think about this math a little bit to see how you can simplify your rates of shaping. I do include in this template document that I give you a little area where I do my checks, because I know that over the entire length of my yoke, I will work rows 1 through 38 a total of 2 times. So I work through it once and then 2 more times, so it's 3 times total. And in each repeat, we increase 28 stitches. So here's the little check. We do 3 total repeats of 28 stitches increased per repeat equals 84 stitches increased, which when I go back to my original document, I say, yep, check, there's my 84 target stitches. And then we're going to do something similar with the rows. We're going to say I work 3 repeats and there are 38 rows per repeat, which is 114 rows worked. When I add my 1 wrong side row at the setup, I guess that works out to 115 rows, which is also my target. Once all of this rather complicated yoke shaping is complete, and remember this does include the short rows that we plan to add to the back of my garment. If you're adding short rows, we're going to move on to the body of our sweater. Now, because we are all going to have very different stitch patterns over we're working, all I simply say is work even with no more increases in your established pattern to the target length of your body. Then you're going to work your hem, and then you're going to bind off. It's that simple. I just want you to have the space to be able to put in your own stitch pattern here. So I will work my body length to be my target of 175 rows. We worked that back here where we determined that the body length of 12 inches works out to 150 rows. And then we've got our 2 rows of ribbing. So I will work my body to 150 rows and my hem to 25 rows for a total of 175 rows. If you prefer not to count your rows, you can knit to your target length without counting rows if you prefer. Hey there folks, all of the microphones, the camera, the fancy lights and everything have been put away. I was mid-edit in this video. Actually, I was editing up to the point that you just watched. And it occurred to me that we should perhaps have a really brief discussion about knitting to a measured length. If you were knitting this garment in the round, meaning you didn't have to seam it, your front and back lengths would be the same length because you'd be working the same number of rounds. So working to that measured length wouldn't have much of an impact. You would just be able to knit to the length you want. When it comes to a garment like this raglan that we're knitting, which we are going to be seaming, having those two seam lengths the same makes finishing the project a lot easier. So I know I just said you can knit to a measured length if you want, and you still can. This is your garment. You can do whatever you want with it, but if I can set you on a path that will make you slightly more successful, I would like to. So you just watched me do the math to figure out how many number of rows I need to reach my target length of 14 inches. I would encourage you to consider this process if it wasn't already something you were planning to do. The reason being is when we seam the side of a garment, we want each halves, the front and the back halves, to have the same number of rows in them to make seaming easier. If there's a really big disparity between the front and the back, I can't imagine it would be a huge disparity, but if you have a different number of rows, seaming can be slightly more challenging. You would have to ease in the additional length you have on one half into the other. So if your back is slightly longer than your front, let's say there's a 5-row disparity, you would have to ease in those 5 rows so that your side seam doesn't really pucker. So as I say, you can do whatever you want with your garment, but if you can do the numbered row method, meaning you know exactly how many rows you have to knit from the underarm to the bottom hem, it's going to make piecing your garment a lot easier. That's it. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I know this video has already been long and I apologize for the disparity in quality between what you've been watching and this. I just wanted to make sure I shared it with you before I signed off. So here comes the sign off. I hope you all survived all that mathing. I know that there is a lot of information stored in my brain that perhaps is not getting out or coming across, especially when it comes to determining the rate of shaping for your yoke. So please don't hesitate to jump into that Ravelry forum, talk to me about your numbers, explain to me your approach, and definitely let me know if you need clarification. I just want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable with the shaping that they're doing in their yoke to make sure that it's going to fit you the way you want it to. In 2 weeks' time, I am going to be back with episode 5. I'm going to say 2-week time with a little bit of an asterisk there. I am truly hoping that I will be done the back of my garment in 2 weeks. If I'm not, I may push it out 1 more week so that we all have the time we need to finish the back and get ready to start on the sleeves, because there's going to be a lot more math for the sleeves. The good news is once you knit one sleeve, the other one is pretty easy to make. Have a wonderful next couple of weeks. Have fun starting knitting on your top, and talk to you again soon. Happy knitting!